The carriage wheels cracked against frozen gravel as Blackwood Manor rose through the fog like a stone giant, waking from 100-year sleep. Katherine pressed her gloved hand against the cold window glass and studied the estate through the mist. 3 stories of dark limestone, ivy crawling up the eastern towers, a slate roof stretching so wide it swallowed the gray sky above it. The kind of house that made you feel small before you ever stepped through the door. She had been married for exactly 9 hours. 9 hours since she stood in a London chapel wearing her mother's ivory silk gown, speaking vows to a man who refused to look at her face while he said his. 9 hours since Duke Arthur of Blackwood slid a gold band onto her finger with the same enthusiasm a man might use to sign a tax receipt. 9 hours since her father squeezed her hand in the vestibule and whispered, "Give it time, Katherine. He'll come around." She was not so sure about that. The carriage lurched to a stop. A footman in dark green livery opened the door and offered his hand. Katherine gathered her traveling cloak around her shoulders and stepped down onto the gravel drive. The cold hit her immediately, a sharp, biting wind that came straight off the northern moors and cut through wool like it was made of paper. Arthur was already standing at the top of the front steps. Tall, dark-haired, jaw set like a man preparing for an argument he intended to win. He wore a long charcoal coat buttoned to the throat, and his hands were clasped behind his back. He watched her approach the way a landlord watches a tenant he expects trouble from. "Welcome to Blackwood," he said. The words had all the warmth of the January wind behind her. "Thank you, Your Grace." Katherine climbed the stone steps and met his eyes. They were gray, the exact same color as the sky over his estate, and just as difficult to read. He turned without offering his arm and walked through the front door. Katherine followed. The entrance hall was enormous, a vaulted ceiling with dark oak beams, a marble floor so polished she could see the chandelier reflected beneath her boots. Portraits of former Blackwood dukes lined the walls in heavy gilded frames, men with stern faces and high collars, staring down at her like a jury that had already made up its mind. A thin woman in a starched black dress stood waiting near the grand staircase. She had silver hair pulled back so tight it seemed to stretch her face, and she held a ring of iron keys at her waist, like a jailer. "Mrs. Pemberton," Arthur said, "this is the new Duchess. Please show her to her quarters." Mrs. Pemberton curtsied. "Of course, Your Grace. The south wing suite has been aired and—" "The north wing." The housekeeper stopped. Her lips parted slightly. "Your Grace?" "The north wing chamber, above the old watchtower." Arthur's voice was perfectly flat. "It's been cleaned, I trust." A silence filled the hall. 2 maids standing near the parlor entrance exchanged a quick glance. Mrs. Pemberton's fingers tightened around her keyring. "It has been swept, sir, yes. Though I should mention, the hearth in that room has a poor draught, and the window casements haven't been properly sealed since." "Then it will do." Arthur looked at Katherine for the first time since they entered the house. There was something deliberate in his expression, something cold and testing. He wanted her to object. He wanted her to protest, to demand the proper Duchess chambers, to give him a reason to call her spoiled or difficult. Katherine held his gaze. "The north wing sounds perfectly adequate. Thank you." Something flickered across his face. Surprise, maybe, or irritation that his first strike had landed without drawing blood. He gave a short nod and walked away down a corridor without another word. Mrs. Pemberton led her up 3 flights of stairs. The first 2 floors were handsome. Papered walls, carpeted hallways, oil paintings, brass sconces polished to a mirror shine. The 3rd floor was different. The carpet disappeared. The wallpaper gave way to bare stone. The air grew colder with every step. They turned down a narrow corridor and stopped at a heavy oak door with iron hinges black with age. "I am sorry, my lady," Mrs. Pemberton said quietly as she turned the key. "This was a storeroom before. and before that, part of the original watchtower. The door swung open. The room was large. Katherine would give it that. High vaulted ceilings built from pale stone arches that met at a central point, like the ribs of a cathedral. A single tall window on the north wall. A narrow iron bedstead pushed into the corner. A washstand. A small coal grate that looked like it hadn't held a proper fire in years, and it was cold. Genuinely, properly cold. The kind of cold that didn't just sit on your skin, but crept into your chest and made a home there. Mrs. Pemberton set down the candle on the washstand. "I'll have extra blankets brought up, my lady, and I can speak to His Grace about." "That won't be necessary." Katherine walked slowly to the center of the room and looked up. The vaulted arches created a natural circulation of air. She could feel it. A gentle, continuous movement across the ceiling, cool and steady and constant. She held up her hand and felt the current pass between her fingers. She turned to the window. It faced due north. No direct sunlight. Consistent low temperature. Stable humidity from the old stone walls. A smile crossed her face. Small, private. The kind of smile that had nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with recognition. Because Katherine had spent 12 years studying botany under her father, one of the finest naturalists in the south of England. She had germinated high-altitude alpine seeds that no London hothouse had ever managed to keep alive. She had spent winters in her father's stone potting shed, learning that the rarest medicinal plants in Europe didn't need warmth to grow. They needed the opposite. They needed stable, cold air, steady circulation, and the kind of patient, undisturbed environment that most people ran away from. And Arthur had just handed her exactly that. She turned back to Mrs. Pemberton, who stood in the doorway looking like a woman attending a funeral. "Mrs. Pemberton, I'll need 3 things brought up by morning. A sturdy wooden table, the widest you can find. A bucket of fresh leaf mold from the courtyard compost heap. And my personal trunk, the heavy one with the brass clasps. The footman will find it strapped to the back of the carriage." The housekeeper blinked. "My lady?" Katherine pulled off her traveling gloves and folded them neatly. "The Duke has given me a room he believes no one could possibly want. I intend to prove him spectacularly wrong." For 5 days, Katherine saw almost nothing of the Duke. He took his meals in the ground-floor dining room at precise hours, 7 in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, 6:30 in the evening, and kept to his private study for the rest of the day. She learned this from Mrs. Pemberton, who brought her breakfast on a tray each morning with an expression that sat somewhere between pity and quiet admiration. Katherine didn't mind the solitude. In fact, she preferred it. Solitude meant no one was watching, and what she was building in the North Wing chamber required exactly that kind of privacy. On the second morning, the heavy brass-clasped trunk arrived. 2 footmen carried it up the 3 flights of stairs, red-faced and grunting, and set it down in the center of the room with obvious relief. Katherine thanked them, closed the door behind them, and knelt on the stone floor. She unlatched the clasps and lifted the lid. Inside, packed in layers of oilcloth and dry straw, sat her father's seed collection. 32 small wooden drawers fitted neatly into a mahogany frame, each one labeled in her father's careful handwriting. Alpine gentian, winter savory, mountain arnica, valerian root, dried chamomile heads wrapped in muslin, willow bark shavings stored in sealed glass vials, seeds collected over 20 years from the Swiss Alps, the Scottish Highlands, the limestone hills of Derbyshire. Every drawer a small treasury of living things, waiting for the right conditions to wake up. Katherine lifted one of the drawers and held it to the pale light from the window. Tiny, dark seeds, no bigger than grains of sand, sitting in a bed of dried moss. "Right then," she said to them, "let's see what you can do." By the 3rd day, The room had begun its transformation. She arranged the wide oak table Mrs. Pemberton had found beneath the central arch, where the air circulation was strongest. She lined it with clay saucers borrowed from the kitchen stores and filled each one with a careful mixture of leaf mold, Powhatan chalk dust, and fine river sand, a growing medium her father had perfected over years of trial and failure. She pressed the alpine seeds gently into the soil with the pad of her thumb, spacing them evenly, marking each saucer with a small paper tag tied to a stick of hazelwood. The room's temperature was perfect. Katherine had measured it using a mercury thermometer she kept wrapped in velvet at the bottom of her trunk. 46 degrees Fahrenheit. Constant. Day and night. The thick stone walls held the cold steady, and the vaulted ceiling kept the air moving just enough to prevent the damp from settling on the soil surface. Most gardeners would have called it impossible. You couldn't grow anything useful in a room this cold. Everyone knew that plants needed warmth, sunlight, the heat of a glasshouse with south-facing panes. Everyone was wrong. Alpine plants were built for exactly this. They germinated slowly in cold air. They sent down deep, strong roots before ever showing a leaf above the surface. And the medicinal compounds they produced, the oils, the resins, the bitter alkaloids that made willow bark ease a fever and chamomile calm a racing heart, grew more concentrated in cold conditions. Her father had proved it. Katherine had helped him prove it, kneeling beside him in his draughty stone potting shed in Hampshire, while her mother hosted dinner parties downstairs, and pretended her daughter wasn't covered in soil up to her elbows. On the fourth evening, she set up the brass oil lamps. She owned 3 of them, squat, heavy things with wide wicks and polished reflectors that threw gentle, steady warmth in a low circle. She placed them at intervals along the table, each one adjusted to its lowest flame. They weren't there to heat the room. They were there to create small pockets of slightly warmer air, directly above the seed trays, just enough to encourage the first root fibers to push downward into the soil without raising the overall temperature of the chamber. It was delicate work. Too much heat, and the alpine seeds would rot. Too little, and they would stay dormant for months. Katherine adjusted the wicks by fractions of an inch, holding her palm above each flame until she found the precise warmth she needed. On the 5th afternoon, she saw the first sign. She was kneeling at the table, turning a saucer of mountain arnica toward the window light, when she noticed a hairline crack in the seed casing. She held her breath and leaned closer. A pale green thread, thinner than an eyelash, was pushing its way out of the split shell and curling downward into the dark soil. The first root. Katherine set the saucer down with trembling hands and pressed her palms flat against the cold table to steady herself. She had done this 100 times in her father's shed. She had watched seeds germinate in every season, in every condition, in containers ranging from porcelain bowls to old teacups. And still, every single time, that first sign of life in dead-looking soil made her chest tighten. She stood and looked around the room. Clay pots lined the window ledge. Glass jars she had collected from the kitchen stores stood in neat rows along the stone shelf above the washstand, each one waiting to be filled with dried herbs and tinctures. The seed drawers sat open on the bedside table, their contents sorted and catalogued in her leather-bound notebook. It was starting to look less like a punishment and more like a laboratory. Somewhere below her, 3 floors down, Arthur sat behind his mahogany desk, surrounded by ledgers and land reports, probably convinced his unwanted wife was shivering alone in misery. He had no idea that the room he gave her out of spite was turning into the most productive space in his entire manor. Katherine picked up her notebook and uncapped her ink. She began recording the arnica germination. Date, time, soil composition, air temperature, lamp distance. Every detail mattered. Every observation would build toward something larger. She just didn't know yet how desperately this house was going to need what she was growing. Mr. Harrison had served the Blackwood estate for 23 years, and in that time, no one had given him cause to climb to the third floor. He was a tall, angular man with a narrow face and side whiskers trimmed to a sharp point. He wore the same dark brown frock coat every day, buttoned so precisely it looked painted onto his frame. He carried a leather-bound inventory ledger under his arm, the way a clergyman carries a Bible, close, constant, and with absolute faith in its authority. Harrison ran Blackwood Manor the way a captain runs a ship. Every candle was counted, every sack of flour weighed and recorded, every lump of coal, allocated by room and by hour, entered in his ledger, in small, faultless handwriting that left no margin for argument. The Duke trusted him completely, and Harrison considered that trust a sacred contract. So when the kitchen stores began showing unusual withdrawals, 6 glass preserving jars here, a bundle of cheesecloth there, an extra scuttle of coal sent upstairs every second day, Harrison noticed immediately. He traced the requests to the north wing. On the 14th morning, he climbed the stairs. Katherine was arranging a wooden drying rack beside the window when the knock came. She opened the door and found Harrison standing in the corridor with his ledger open, a pencil tucked behind his ear, and an expression that suggested he had already decided how this conversation would end. "Good morning, my lady." He glanced past her into the room. His eyes moved across the table of clay saucers, the rows of labeled glass jars, the brass oil lamps, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from a cord strung between 2 iron wall hooks. His thin nostrils flared slightly. "Mr. Harrison, how kind of you to visit." "I'm afraid this is a matter of household accounts, my lady." He held up the ledger and tapped a column of figures with one bony finger. "Over the past 12 days, your quarters have drawn additional coal beyond the standard allocation, along with glassware, cloth, and various stores from the kitchen pantry. I've itemized the full list here." Katherine leaned against the doorframe. And these items were requisitioned without prior approval through my office. All household stores are managed centrally, my lady. That is the standing policy of Blackwood Manor, established under the 3rd Duke and maintained without exception since. "I see. And you've come to tell me I need your written permission to take a jar from the kitchen." Harrison's jaw tightened. "I've come to inform you that these requisitions will be suspended until proper channels are followed. I've already spoken to Mrs. Pemberton about the matter." Katherine studied him for a long moment. She had known men like Harrison her entire life. Competent, rigid, and deeply territorial. The kind of man who measured his own worth by how tightly he controlled everything around him. He wasn't cruel. He was something more difficult to deal with. He was certain. "Mr. Harrison, may I ask you a question?" "Of course, my lady." "When the Duke assigned me this room, did he place any restrictions on how I furnished or arranged it?" Harrison paused. "I don't believe specific instructions were given regarding—" "Then you'll be aware that under the standard terms of a marriage settlement in this county, the Duchess is entitled to the free management of her personal living quarters, including any furnishings, supplies, and domestic articles she requires for her own use." Katherine folded her arms. "That's not my opinion, Mr. Harrison. That's Blackstone's Commentaries, Volume the 1st, Chapter 15, if I remember correctly, though you're welcome to check." The pencil behind Harrison's ear seemed to droop slightly. "Furthermore," Katherine continued, "the items I've drawn from the kitchen stores amount to less than 2 shillings in total value. I have a personal allowance written into my marriage contract that covers household incidentals up to £5 per quarter. So unless you're suggesting that 6 glass jars and a bag of coal exceed £5, I believe my requisitions are entirely within my legal rights." Harrison closed his ledger. Slowly, the way a man closes a door he has just realized he cannot lock. "My lady, I mean no disrespect, I simply have a duty to maintain accurate records of all estate expenditures, and I cannot have unregulated, then regulate them. Katherine stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in, look at everything I've taken. Write it down in your book, assign it a line item, give it a heading if you like. I have absolutely no objection to your records, Mr. Harrison. What I object to is being told I cannot use my own quarters as I see fit. He hesitated at the threshold. She could see the war behind his eyes, curiosity pulling against pride. Finally, he stepped inside. He stood in the middle of the room and turned a full circle. The clay saucers on the table had changed in the past week. Pale green shoots were pushing up through the dark soil in neat rows. The glass jars on the shelf above the washstand now held dried chamomile heads, pressed valerian leaves, and finely ground willow bark. The air smelled of lavender and something sharper underneath, rosemary oil, distilled in a small copper vessel that sat on the corner of the table. "What is all this?" he asked. His voice had lost its official edge. "Botany, Mr. Harrison. Medicinal botany. Specifically, these are alpine and cold climate specimens that require exactly the temperature and air conditions this room provides." He leaned over a saucer and squinted at the tiny green shoots. "You're growing plants. In a stone tower. In January." "I am." He straightened up and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen before. It sat somewhere between confusion and reluctant respect, like a man watching someone solve a puzzle he had declared impossible. "I'll record the stores," he said stiffly, "and I'll expect a written list in advance for any future requirements. You'll have one every Monday morning." Harrison tucked his ledger under his arm and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame and looked back at the rows of green shoots one more time. "Chamomile," he said quietly, almost to himself. "My mother used to grow that in her kitchen garden in Suffolk." Then he left, and his footsteps echoed down the stone corridor like a man retreating from a battlefield he hadn't expected to find. Katherine had not left the manor grounds since her arrival. 22 days inside stone walls, climbing the same 3 flights of stairs, looking out the same north-facing window at the same gray sky. She knew every crack in her chamber ceiling, every draught that crept beneath the door at midnight, every sound the old watchtower made when the wind changed direction. On the 22nd morning, she woke before dawn and decided she had seen enough stone for one lifetime. She dressed in her warmest wool walking dress, dark green, high-collared, with a thick pelisse over the top, and a pair of sturdy leather half-boots her father had bought her for country rambles. She wrapped a woolen shawl over her bonnet, pulled on her lined gloves, and slipped out through the kitchen entrance before Mrs. Pemberton had even lit the first kettle. The estate was enormous. She had known that from the marriage papers. 4,000 acres, stretching from the manor house east toward the river and north into open moorland. But reading a number on a solicitor's page and standing at the edge of it in the freezing dark were very different things. The land rolled away from her in every direction, white with frost, silent, except for the occasional cry of a curlew somewhere out in the heather. She walked east. The home fields closest to the manor were fenced with low stone walls and divided into neat strips. Winter wheat should have been showing green shoots by now, thin, pale blades pushing through the frozen topsoil in rows. Katherine stopped at the first gate and looked across the nearest field. Nothing. The soil was bare, dark and flat and completely lifeless, like the surface of a cold hearth swept clean of ashes. She climbed the gate and dropped into the field. The ground was hard under her boots, compacted and gray. She knelt and pressed her fingers into the top inch of soil. It crumbled like chalk, dry, powdery, with no structure at all. No worms, no root fibers, no dark, rich smell of healthy earth breaking down organic matter into the kind of nourishment crops needed to survive. Katherine pulled a handful of soil to her nose and inhaled. Flat, mineral, dead. She had smelled soil like this before. Her father had taken her to a tenant farm in Wiltshire once, years ago, where the landlord had planted barley in the same field for 9 consecutive seasons without rest or rotation. The ground had simply given up. Every nutrient stripped out. Every living organism starved. The soil reduced to something closer to powdered chalk than productive farmland. The harvest that year had been so thin, the tenant's family nearly went under. Katherine stood and brushed off her knees. She walked further east, climbing 2 more stone walls, crossing a frozen drainage ditch on a plank bridge, until she reached the far pastures where the estate's cattle would graze come spring. The same story everywhere. Exhausted soil. No cover crops planted to hold nitrogen through the winter months. No evidence of lime application or manure spreading. Field after field of bare, depleted earth, waiting for a growing season it could not possibly support. She crouched again in the furthest field and opened the small canvas satchel she had brought over her shoulder. Inside were 6 squares of clean linen, each one folded into a pocket. She scooped soil from different depths, the surface layer 2 inches down, 4 inches down, and sealed each sample into its own linen square, tying the tops with thread from her sewing kit. She labeled each one with a stub of pencil, field position, depth, date. By the time she turned back toward the manor, the sun had risen just enough to throw a thin gold line across the moor. The house stood dark against it, its chimneys trailing smoke into the pale sky. From this distance, she could see the shape of the place properly for the first time, the grand south wing where Arthur lived, the servants' quarters along the western side, and there, at the far corner, rising slightly above the roofline, the old watchtower that held her room. She felt a strange pull looking at it. That cold, unwanted chamber, 3 floors up in a forgotten wing, was more hers than any room she had ever occupied, and it was about to become more important than anyone in that house understood. Back in the north wing, Katherine cleared a space on the table beside her seed trays and laid the soil samples out in a row. She untied each linen pocket and spread the soil onto separate sheets of white writing paper, pressing each sample flat with a palette knife. The differences were visible immediately. The surface layer was pale and powdery, almost no organic content. The deeper samples were marginally darker, but still lacked the crumb structure that healthy farmland should have. She examined each one under her brass magnifying lens, turning the paper slowly, looking for any sign of root matter, insect activity, or fungal threads. There were none. She opened her notebook and began writing. The entry filled 3 pages. She recorded every observation: soil color, texture, height smell, depth analysis, field position relative to the manor. At the bottom of the 3rd page, she wrote a single line and underlined it twice. This estate will produce less than a quarter of its expected spring yield. Without intervention before March, the harvest will fail entirely. Katherine set down her pen and looked at the linen packets spread across the table. 6 small squares of dead earth from a 4,000-acre estate that an entire household depended on for income, food, and survival. Arthur didn't know yet. He was 3 floors below her, buried in his ledgers, counting last season's profits and assuming the next season would deliver the same. Harrison was probably beside him, running his bony finger down columns of figures that told him everything about what the estate had earned and absolutely nothing about what the land could actually give. She picked up the nearest soil sample and rubbed it between her fingers. It fell apart like powder. They were going to need her, both of them. The proud Duke and his stubborn steward. They simply didn't know it yet. The frost came on a Tuesday, 6 weeks before anyone expected it. Katherine heard it before she felt it. A deep, groaning crack from somewhere below the manor, the sound of the old stone water cistern splitting as the temperature plunged through the night. She sat up in bed and pulled the blanket to her chin. Her breath came out in a white cloud that hung in the dark air above her face. She reached for the thermometer on her bedside table and held it close to the candle. 29 degrees. The room had dropped nearly 20 degrees in a single night. Even for the north wing, that was extraordinary. By dawn, the estate had transformed. Katherine stood at her window and looked out across a landscape sealed in white. Every field, every fence post, every bare branch on every tree was coated in a thick crust of ice that caught the early light like broken glass. The stream that ran along the eastern boundary had frozen solid. She could see it from the tower, a pale ribbon cutting through the white fields, completely still. Downstairs, the manor was in chaos. Katherine heard it as she descended the stairs. Raised voices from the kitchen, doors banging, the sound of boots on stone floors moving faster than servants' boots should ever move in a well-ordered house. She found Mrs. Pemberton in the ground-floor hallway, directing 2 kitchen maids carrying armfuls of woolen blankets toward the back entrance. "What's happened?" The housekeeper's face was drawn tight. "The stables, my lady." Thomas, the head groom, found 3 of the farmhands collapsed in the hay barn at first light. Cold fever, and 2 more in the dairy house. The frost came so fast overnight, they couldn't keep the fires going. "How many are sick?" "9 so far. Thomas says more are coming in from the outer farms, complaining of the same thing. Shaking, sweating, chest pains. Dr. Hartley rode in from the village an hour ago." Katherine followed the blankets through the kitchen and out the back entrance to the stable yard. The scene there stopped her in her stride. Men were lying on straw pallets, arranged along the wall of the main stable block, wrapped in horse blankets and whatever coats had been found. Some of them were shivering so violently their teeth made an audible rattle. Others lay still with their eyes closed, breathing in shallow, ragged gasps that produced clouds of vapor in the frozen air. A young lad, who couldn't have been older than 16, sat propped against a barrel, his face the color of candle wax. Dr. Hartley was kneeling beside the nearest man, pressing a cloth soaked in cold water against his forehead. He was a stout, gray-haired man with spectacles perched on the end of his nose, and he looked exhausted already. Katherine crouched beside him. "Doctor, what do you need?" He glanced up at her. "Willow bark, chamomile, dried elderflower if you have it. Anything to bring the fever down and calm the chest. I've used everything I carried with me, and the apothecary in the village has been stripped bare since last week. Half the county is down with the same thing. I have willow bark, dried chamomile, valerian root for the ones who can't sleep through the shaking." Hartley stared at her over his spectacles. "You have willow bark? Here? In January? Dried and ground. Enough for 20 doses at least, possibly more. And I have fresh chamomile tincture that I distilled myself less than a week ago." The doctor's face changed. The weariness didn't leave. It couldn't, not with 9 men lying on straw in a frozen stable yard. But something behind it shifted, a kind of desperate relief. "Then for heaven's sake, my lady, bring it down." Katherine climbed the 3 flights of stairs faster than she had ever climbed them. She pulled open the door to her chamber and went straight to the shelf above the washstand. The glass jars stood in their neat rows, each one labeled in her handwriting. She selected 4: willow bark powder, dried chamomile heads, ground valerian root, and a small bottle of concentrated chamomile tincture, sealed with a cork and wax. She grabbed her leather notebook, a brass measuring spoon, and a clean muslin straining cloth, and carried everything back down to the kitchen. Mrs. Pemberton had already set water boiling in the largest copper kettle. Katherine worked at the kitchen table with a speed and precision that made the 2 kitchen maids stop and watch. She measured willow bark powder into a ceramic bowl. 1 level spoonful per dose, and poured hot water over it, stirring until it dissolved into a bitter amber liquid. She strained the chamomile through the muslin into a separate jug and added 3 drops of her concentrated tincture to strengthen it. This first, she handed the willow bark infusion to Mrs. Pemberton. "Half a cup for each man with a fever. It tastes foul, so tell them to drink it fast." The chamomile follows 30 minutes later. It calms the chest and helps them sleep. Anyone still shaking after an hour gets a second dose of the willow bark. The housekeeper took the bowl and looked at Katherine with something close to wonder. "Where did you learn all this, my lady?" "My father." Katherine was already measuring a second batch. He believed that a woman who could name every flower in a garden but couldn't use a single one to heal a sick person had wasted her education entirely. By midday, the first doses had taken hold. The violent shivering had eased in 6 of the 9 men. 2 were sleeping. The young lad by the barrel was sitting up and drinking broth, color returning to his face in slow patches. Dr. Hartley found Katherine in the kitchen, washing out the measuring spoons, and looked at her the way a man looks at a locked door that has just swung open on its own. "My lady, I have practiced medicine in this county for 14 years. I have never once received willow bark remedy this potent in the middle of winter. Where on earth are you growing these specimens?" Katherine hung the muslin cloth over the drying rack and smiled. "Would you like to see?" Arthur heard about the medicines before he saw them. He had spent the morning in his study with the estate accounts spread across his desk, rent rolls, grain ledgers, livestock tallies, trying to calculate how much the early frost would cost him. The numbers were bad. The frozen stream meant no water for the mill. The sick farm hands meant no labor for the outer fields. The cattle had been pulled into the barns early, burning through winter feed stores that were supposed to last until March. He was working through a column of figures for the 3rd time when his valet, Simmons, brought in the afternoon tea tray and mentioned, almost casually, that 6 of the 9 sick men in the stable yard were sitting up and taking solid food. Arthur looked up. "Dr. Hartley managed that?" "Dr. Hartley had run out of medicines entirely, Your Grace. It was the Duchess who provided the remedies. From her personal stores, I understand. The servants have been going up to her room all morning to collect treatments." Arthur set down his pen. "Going up to her room?" "Yes, Your Grace. The north wing. Mrs. Pemberton says the Duchess has been mixing medicines in the kitchen since dawn. Willow bark infusions, chamomile preparations, that sort of thing. Dr. Hartley apparently called them the finest winter remedies he's encountered in 14 years of practice." Simmons poured the tea and left. Arthur sat very still for a long time, looking at the doorway his valet had just walked through. Then he pushed back his chair and stood. He climbed the stairs slowly. 1st floor, 2nd floor, 3rd floor, where the carpet ended and the bare stone began. He had not been to the north wing since the day he ordered Katherine placed there. He had not needed to. He had put her in that room because it was the worst chamber in the house, cold, forgotten, and so far from the main residence that she would feel the full weight of her insignificance every time she climbed those stairs. He reached the heavy oak door and pushed it open without knocking. Then he stopped. The room he remembered was a bare, draughty storeroom with an iron bedstead and a cracked window. What he walked into was something else entirely. The wide oak table beneath the central arch was covered in neat rows of clay saucers, each one holding healthy green plants in various stages of growth. Small paper tags identified each specimen in a tidy hand. The stone shelf above the washstand held 24 glass jars arranged by size, their contents labeled and dated: dried herbs, ground bark, pressed leaves, dark amber tinctures sealed with cork and wax. Bundles of lavender and rosemary hung from a cord strung between the wall hooks, filling the air with a clean, sharp scent that cut through the cold. A copper distillation vessel sat in the corner with a glass collecting flask beside it. The brass oil lamps glowed at low flame along the table's edge, their reflectors casting warm circles of light across the pale stone ceiling. Every surface was orderly, every jar aligned, every plant tended. The room was cold, yes, the air still carried that deep chill from the stone walls, but it was alive, breathing, working. Katherine stood at the far end of the table with a measuring spoon in one hand and a ceramic mixing bowl in the other. She was preparing another batch of something. He could smell the bitter sharpness of willow bark in the steam rising from the bowl. She looked up when the door opened and met his gaze without flinching. Arthur walked slowly into the room. He stopped at the table and looked down at the rows of green shoots pushing up through dark soil. He touched the edge of one clay saucer with his fingertip, as if confirming it was real. "How long has this been here?" "Since the 5th day after my arrival." He picked up one of the glass jars and turned it in his hand. The label read chamomile, dried heads, harvested day 30, north wing chamber. He set it back down carefully. "You grew medicinal herbs, in a stone tower, in the dead of winter. Alpine specimens germinate best in cold, stable air, with consistent circulation. This room provides exactly those conditions." Katherine set down the mixing bowl. The vaulted ceilings create a natural draft that prevents moisture from settling on the soil. The north-facing window keeps the temperature steady without direct sunlight. The thick walls hold the cold at a constant level day and night. It is, quite possibly, the finest natural growing chamber I have ever worked in. Arthur said nothing for a long moment. He stood in the middle of the room his ancestors had used to store broken furniture, surrounded by living plants and labeled medicines, and Katherine watched something move across his face. It wasn't anger. It wasn't embarrassment. It was the slow, uncomfortable recognition of a man realizing he had made a serious miscalculation. "Your remedies," he said quietly. "Simmons tells me they worked faster than anything Hartley had. Willow bark grown in cold conditions produces a higher concentration of the compounds that reduce fever. My father documented it extensively. The colder the growing environment, the more potent the medicine." Arthur looked at her, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since their wedding day. She stood in the room he had given her as an insult, dressed in a plain gray wool gown with her sleeves rolled to the elbows and soil under her fingernails, and she was the most capable person on his entire estate. Katherine reached behind her and picked up a leather-bound notebook. She held it out to him. "What is this?" "Soil analysis. I walked your eastern fields 3 weeks ago and took samples. Your land is exhausted, Arthur. The topsoil has been stripped of every nutrient through years of repeated cropping without rotation or rest. If nothing changes before spring planting, your harvest will fail. I've written a full assessment with proposed solutions. Crop rotation schedules, winter cover planting, lime and composting programs to rebuild the soil structure over 2 growing seasons." Arthur took the notebook and opened it. Page after page of detailed observations, diagrams, measurements, and carefully reasoned recommendations filled every line. It was more thorough than any report Harrison had ever produced in 23 years of service. He closed the notebook and held it at his side. "I'll read it tonight," he said. Then he turned and walked out of the room, carrying her work with him down the stairs in silence. Arthur read the notebook twice. The first time, he sat in his study with a glass of brandy untouched beside him and turned the pages slowly, following Katherine's handwriting from the opening soil assessment through the field-by-field breakdown to the final recommendations at the back. The second time, he read it with a pencil in his hand, marking passages he didn't fully understand so he could ask her about them in the morning. He never did ask. Pride kept the pencil marks to himself. Instead, he summoned the head groundsman, a weathered old Yorkshireman named Farrow, and handed him the notebook at breakfast. Read this. Tell me if it's sound." Pharaoh took 3 days to go through it. He walked the eastern fields with the notebook open in his rough hands, kneeling in the frozen soil, at each point Katherine had marked, testing the earth between his fingers, the way she had described. On the 3rd evening, he appeared in Arthur's study, with his hat in his hands and mud on both knees. "It's sound, Your Grace." "All of it?" "Every word." "The soil's done. I've been saying it for 2 years, sir, but Mr. Harrison kept telling me to plant the same rotation and stop making a fuss. The Duchess has put down on paper what the ground's been screaming at us since last spring." Arthur dismissed him and sat alone in the dark study for a long while after that. The next morning, he gave the order. 1 test field. The long strip along the eastern boundary wall, roughly 3 acres, close enough to the manor for easy observation. Katherine's methods would be applied exactly as she had written them. If the field showed results, the program would expand to the full estate in spring. Harrison objected, of course. He appeared in Arthur's study within the hour, his ledger pressed against his chest like a shield. The test would cost money. Lime had to be purchased and carted in from the quarry, labor diverted from other winter tasks, seed stock acquired for cover crops that Harrison considered entirely unproven. He stood in front of the desk and listed his concerns in the same careful, measured voice he used for everything, and Arthur let him finish without interruption. "Your objections are noted, Mr. Harrison. Proceed with the Duchess's instructions." Harrison left the room with his mouth set in a line so thin it nearly disappeared into his face. The work began on a cold, dry Thursday. Pharaoh and 4 of the recovered farmhands spread crushed limestone across the test field using hand barrows, working in long rows from the boundary wall inward. The lime had arrived the previous day on a cart from the Derbyshire quarry, 2 tons of pale powder that settled over the dark soil like a dusting of snow. Katherine supervised from the field edge, wrapped in her green pelisse, with her notebook open. She directed the spreading rates, heavier application at the northern end, where her soil samples had shown the worst depletion. Lighter toward the south, where some organic matter still survived in the deeper layers. Pharaoh listened to her instructions without question. Whatever reservations he might have held about taking orders from a woman had evaporated the moment he read her field analysis. The second phase came a week later. Katherine had been growing nitrogen-rich cover crops in her north wing chamber, winter vetch and crimson clover, started in deep clay troughs she had requisitioned from the garden stores. The plants were young, their root systems dense and tangled, exactly what exhausted soil needed. They would be turned directly into the ground, where their decomposing roots and leaves would feed the earth with the nutrients that years of careless cropping had drained away. She carried the troughs downstairs herself, one at a time, refusing help from the kitchen maids who offered. Each trough weighed enough to make her arms ache by the second flight of stairs, but she wanted to place every plant personally, pressing each root cluster into the limed soil with her own hands. Arthur watched from the boundary wall. He had told himself he was there to oversee the labor costs. That was the reason he gave Simmons when he pulled on his riding boots after breakfast and walked down to the eastern fields instead of sitting at his desk. Estate management, financial oversight, the kind of practical, masculine concern that justified a duke standing in a frozen field at 8 o'clock in the morning. But he wasn't watching the laborers. He was watching Katherine. She knelt in the cold soil in a pair of old leather gloves, with her skirt hems dark with mud, and she worked with a kind of focused certainty that Arthur had never seen in anyone who had ever managed his land. She didn't hesitate. She didn't second-guess her own measurements or ask Pharaoh for confirmation. She placed each plant with the precision of someone who understood exactly what the earth needed and exactly how to provide it. It made him uncomfortable in a way he couldn't quite name. 3 weeks passed. February turned toward March, and the cold held firm across the county. The rest of the estate's fields remained bare and frozen, their depleted soil offering nothing to the pale winter light. Neighboring estates reported the same: empty fields, poor projections, anxious landlords writing letters to their bankers. The test field was different. Katherine saw it first. She walked down to the eastern boundary on a gray Tuesday morning and stopped at the stone wall. The limed soil had changed color, darker now, richer, with a crumb texture visible even from the field edge. And pushing up through the surface, in uneven clusters that would thicken over the coming weeks, were the first green shoots of the cover crop taking hold in open ground. She climbed the wall and knelt. The roots had spread. She could feel them when she pressed her fingers into the top layer, a web of fine fibers threading through the soil, binding it, feeding it, pulling nitrogen from the air, and locking it into the earth, where the spring crops would find it waiting. Pharaoh found her there an hour later, still kneeling, still examining root systems with her magnifying lens. "It's working, isn't it, my lady?" Katherine brushed the soil from her gloves and stood. The green shoots stretched out in front of her, across 3 acres of land that every other person on this estate had written off as finished. "Yes, Mr. Pharaoh, it is very much working." The summons came after supper. Katherine was in her chamber, recording the latest growth measurements from her alpine specimens, when Mrs. Pemberton knocked and delivered the message. The Duke wished to see her in his private library at 9 o'clock. No further explanation was offered. She set down her pen, washed the soil from her hands in the basin, and changed into a clean dress, a deep blue wool gown with a high collar and long sleeves. She pinned her hair properly, something she hadn't bothered with in weeks, and checked her reflection in the small mirror above the washstand. The woman looking back at her had changed since arriving at Blackwood, thinner in the face, stronger in the shoulders, hands rougher than any duchess's hands had a right to be. She looked like exactly what she was, someone who had been working. She descended the 3 flights of stairs and crossed the main hall to the west corridor. Arthur's private library sat at the far end, behind a pair of tall mahogany doors that she had never been invited through before. She knocked once. "Come in." The room was warm. That was the first thing she noticed, the almost shocking warmth after weeks of living in the perpetual cold of the north wing. A large fire burned in a marble hearth. The walls were lined floor to ceiling with leather-bound volumes in dark oak shelving. A Persian carpet covered the stone floor in deep reds and blues. 2 leather armchairs faced the fire, and a heavy writing desk stood beneath the window, its surface covered in papers and ledgers. Arthur stood beside the hearth with one arm resting on the mantelpiece. He had removed his coat and stood in his waistcoat and shirt sleeves, which Katherine had never seen before. It made him look younger, less like a title, and more like a man. Her notebook, the soil analysis, lay open on the desk. "Please sit," he said. Katherine took the armchair nearest the door. Arthur remained standing. He looked at the fire for a long moment, and she could see him assembling words in his head, turning them over, discarding the ones that didn't fit. Whatever he had called her here to say, it was costing him something to say it. "I owe you an explanation," he began. "About the room. About the north wing. You don't owe me anything, Arthur. I do." He turned from the fire and looked at her directly. "Your father and mine were involved in a land dispute that lasted 11 years. A boundary disagreement over 400 acres of grazing pasture along the county line. My father believed your father had falsified survey documents to claim land that rightfully belonged to Blackwood. The case went to the county assizes twice and was never fully resolved before either of them died." Katherine said nothing. She had known about the dispute. Her father had mentioned it once, briefly, calling it a misunderstanding between proud men that should have been settled over a glass of port rather than through solicitors. She had never known the details. When our marriage was arranged, Arthur continued, I agreed to it because the terms resolved the land question permanently. Your family's claim was surrendered as part of the settlement. I considered it a victory. He paused. And I treated you accordingly. I put you in that room because I wanted you to understand that this marriage was a transaction and that I had won it. The fire cracked and settled in the grate. A log shifted, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney. I was wrong, Arthur said. About the room. About you. About everything I assumed a woman with your family name would be. I have spent 70 days watching you turn a punishment into something I couldn't have built with 10 years and 10,000 pounds. You grew medicines in a stone tower and saved my workers when my own physician had nothing left to give them. You diagnosed a soil failure that my steward missed for 3 consecutive growing seasons. You designed a recovery program that my head groundsman calls the most intelligent piece of land management he has seen in 30 years of working this earth. He picked up the notebook from the desk and held it in both hands, the way a man holds something valuable. I read this 4 times, Katherine, every page, every diagram, every recommendation, and I showed it to Pharaoh, who confirmed every observation you made. Your test field is the only piece of productive ground on this estate right now, the only one. Katherine watched his face. The stiffness was still there. Arthur was not a man who would ever bend easily, but underneath it, she could see the fracture lines, the places where certainty had cracked, and something more honest was pushing through. Harrison submitted his resignation this morning, Arthur said. I accepted it. Katherine straightened. You dismissed him? He dismissed himself. I showed him your soil report and asked why none of the failures you identified appeared in any of his annual surveys. He couldn't answer. He told me he had managed this estate faithfully for 23 years, and that he would not stand by while unproven methods undermined his record. I told him his record was a failing harvest and 9 sick men in a stable yard. He left within the hour. Arthur set the notebook down on the mantelpiece beside his arm and turned to face her fully. I want to offer you something, and I want you to understand that I'm offering it because you've earned it, and for no other reason. Katherine waited, full authority. The estate's agricultural program, the winter gardens, the soil recovery, all of it. Your name on the management ledger beside mine. Equal partnership in every decision concerning the grounds, the crops, and the long-term development of Blackwood's land. The fire filled the silence between them. Katherine looked at this man, this proud, difficult, stubborn man who had tried to break her spirit with a cold room and was now handing her the keys to his entire legacy. I'll need a proper glasshouse, she said, connected to the north wing, tall enough for the alpine specimens to reach full growth, and I'll need Pharaoh kept on permanently with authority over the field workers. Arthur almost smiled. It didn't quite reach his mouth, but it touched the corners of his eyes in a way Katherine hadn't seen before. Agreed. And the north wing stays mine. Every room on that floor. I'll need the space for expanded growing operations through next winter. Done. Katherine stood and extended her hand. Arthur looked at it. A duchess offering a handshake like a business partner rather than a curtsy like a wife. And something shifted behind his gray eyes. He took her hand and held it firmly. Welcome to Blackwood, Katherine, he said, properly this time. Spring arrived at Blackwood the way it always did in the north of England, slowly, grudgingly, as if the land itself needed convincing that winter was truly finished. The first sign came in the 2nd week of April. A blackbird sang from the oak tree beside the kitchen garden at 5:30 in the morning, loud enough to wake Mrs. Pemberton in her ground-floor quarters. By the end of the week, the frost had retreated from the lower fields, and the stream along the eastern boundary was running again, thin and clear over the stones. Katherine stood at her north wing window and watched the color return to the estate in stages. pale green spreading across the meadows, yellow crocuses pushing through the soil along the south wall of the manor. The dark, bare branches of the orchard filling with tight buds that would open into blossom within the fortnight. Below her window, in the courtyard, she could hear the sounds that had filled the last 6 weeks. The ring of hammers, the scrape of saws, the shouts of workmen passing materials up scaffolding. The conservatory was nearly finished. Arthur had brought in a master glazier from York and a team of carpenters from the county town. The structure rose directly from the north wing wall, a long, elegant framework of wrought iron and glass that extended 40 feet into what had previously been an unused gravel yard. The design was Katherine's own, sketched in her notebook during the dark February evenings and refined over 3 weeks of discussion with the glazier, who had initially looked at her drawings with open skepticism and ended up calling them the most structurally efficient glasshouse plans he had ever been asked to build. The roof was angled to capture maximum light, while allowing excess heat to escape through ventilation panels along the ridge. The north wall, shared with Katherine's original chamber, retained the cold stone that kept the temperature stable for her alpine specimens. The south-facing glass panels flooded the interior with sunlight during the day, creating a graduated climate that moved from cold at one end to warm at the other. Different plants could occupy different zones according to their needs. It was, in effect, 3 growing environments contained within a single structure. Katherine had overseen every stage of the construction personally. She approved every iron joint, tested every glass panel for proper seal, and argued with the lead carpenter twice over the placement of the internal shelving, until he admitted her arrangement allowed better air circulation than his original plan. The workmen had stopped calling her "my lady" by the 3rd week and started calling her "ma'am" in the same tone they used for Pharaoh, respectful, direct, and entirely without ceremony. On the morning the final glass panel was fitted, Katherine walked through the completed conservatory alone. The space was extraordinary. Sunlight poured through the southern panes and fell in long, bright columns across the stone floor. The air smelled of fresh timber, clean glass, and the faintest trace of the lavender and rosemary that had already been transferred from her chamber into the new growing beds along the east wall. Iron shelving lined both sides, ready for the hundreds of clay pots and glass jars that would fill them over the coming months. A long oak workbench ran down the center, wider and sturdier than the makeshift table she had used upstairs, built specifically for mixing medicines and preparing soil compounds. At the far end, a door opened directly into her original north wing chamber. She walked through it and stood in the vaulted stone room where everything had begun. The seed chests still sat on the bedside table. The brass oil lamps still stood on the shelf. The clay saucers that had held her first alpine seedlings were stacked neatly in the corner, emptied now, their contents transplanted into the conservatory's permanent growing beds. The room looked smaller than she remembered, quieter, like a chapter that had served its purpose and was waiting to become part of a larger story. She heard footsteps on the stone stairs. Arthur appeared in the doorway, slightly out of breath from the climb. He wore his riding coat and carried a rolled document under his arm. "Pharaoh sent word from the eastern fields," he said. "The spring planting went in this morning. Full rotation, exactly as your program specified. He says the soil in the test field is the healthiest ground on the estate." Katherine nodded. She had visited the test field 2 days ago. The cover crops had been turned into the earth as planned, and the soil beneath was dark, rich, and crumbling with life. Worms had returned. Root structures were rebuilding. The land was healing. And the other fields? Limbed and rested through winter. As you instructed. Pharaoh is confident the spring barley will establish well. He's projecting a full harvest for the first time in 3 years. Arthur unrolled the document he was carrying and held it out to her. It was the estate's management ledger, the master record of all agricultural operations, staffing, and expenditure. At the top of the first page, in fresh ink, 2 names were written side by side: Duke Arthur of Blackwood, Duchess Katherine of Blackwood. The solicitor finalized the paperwork yesterday, Arthur said. Equal authority. Your name carries the same weight as mine on every decision regarding the grounds, the gardens, and the agricultural program. It's legally binding. Katherine took the ledger and looked at her name on the page. 5 months ago, she had arrived at this house as a transaction, a signature on a marriage contract that settled someone else's debt. She had climbed these stairs carrying nothing except a trunk of seeds and a lifetime of knowledge that nobody in this house had believed was worth anything. "Shall we walk through it?" Arthur asked. "The conservatory, properly." They walked together through the connecting door and into the glass house. The late morning sun filled the space with golden light that warmed the stone floor beneath their feet. Katherine's alpine specimens occupied the cold northern end, rows of thriving medicinal plants that had survived the worst winter the county had seen in a decade. The warmer southern end held the beginnings of her expanded collection: herb seedlings, flowering plants for tinctures, and the first experimental vegetables she planned to grow through the following winter. Arthur stopped at the central workbench and ran his hand along the oak surface. "I gave you the worst room in this house," he said quietly, "and you turned it into the reason this estate is still standing." Katherine looked back through the open door at the cold stone chamber beyond, the room that was supposed to exile her. The room that became a laboratory, an apothecary, a nursery for living things that saved men's lives and restored dying land. The room that taught a proud duke that the woman he had tried to diminish was the most valuable partner he would ever find. "You gave me exactly what I needed, Arthur," she said. "You just didn't know it at the time." They stood together in the conservatory as the spring light moved slowly across the glass, and for the first time since Katherine had arrived at Blackwood Manor, the house felt like something it had never been before. It felt like home.